Hello again. Now, I shall have to choose my words very carefully this morning because YouTube are as touchy these days about the war in Ukraine as they were about COVID a few months ago. And I'm sure we all remember how much trouble I managed to get into over COVID. YouTube's community guidelines say that our community guidelines prohibit content denying, minimizing, or trivializing well documented violent events. We are now removing content about Russia's invasion in Ukraine that violates this policy. Okay, I shall, as they say, take this on board. Not that I have any intention of denying, minimizing, or trivializing the conflict. Heaven knows it's ghastly enough, but one cannot be too careful with YouTube these days. What I want to talk about today is the elephant in the room as relates to the war in Ukraine, by which I mean the Holodomor and also the collaborations with the Germans during the Second World War. I don't know how many viewers have heard of this dreadful business, but without knowing about these things, it is quite literally impossible to understand the war between Russia and Ukraine. For example, why do so many Ukrainians seem to hate the Russians? Why do the Russians keep accusing the Ukrainians of being Nazis? Accusing the leader of Ukraine, a Jew, of being a Nazi is a bit odd, surely. When Stalin took control of the Soviet Union, which of course included Ukraine at that time, Lithuania, various other places like the other Baltic states and so on, which are now independent countries, he was determined that his nation would become industrialised and be the equal of countries such as America in productivity of things like steel and machinery. The way to do this was to break up the little peasant holdings in places like the Ukraine and turn them into huge collective farms. When they were more efficient, then the wheat they produced could be used to feed the urban proletariat in cities like Leningrad. For various reasons, the result was that although the cities were fed, the countryside starved. All the produce was taken to feed factory workers and so on, and there was not enough to feed many peasants in the Ukraine. Perhaps 7 million people died in the famine there in the 1930s, although there is a lot of controversy about the precise figure. This disaster is known as the Holodomor. Anybody wanting to know about this period in Ukrainian history could do a lot worse than read books like this. I've got here Kuznetsov's Baba Yar and of course the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. Kuznetsov describes in detail the famine and the aftermath and also the German occupation during the Second World War. Solzhenitsyn also touches upon it in the Gulag Archipelago. Dissidents like this give us quite an objective account of the period and about the events in Ukraine. This is one part of the story, why many Ukrainians hate the Russians. Now we come to the second part, why many Russians hate the Ukrainians. Because of the famine, known as the Holodomor, when Germany invaded Russia and Ukraine, many Ukrainians who felt ill-disposed towards the Soviets, collaborated with the German army and actually joined it. There were Ukrainian SS units and, what is worse, many of the guards at Treblinka, the death camp where 2 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, were Ukrainian. This is why Putin refers to Ukrainian Nazis. The memory of what Russia sees as a Ukrainian betrayal during the Second World War is still fresh. Hardly any of the people in this country that I hear expressing support for Ukraine have the faintest idea about any of this. Mention the Ukrainian role in the Holocaust, Baba Yar and so on, and they look at me blankly. Talk of the Holodomor, and I have no idea at all what that might have been. Collectivization and industrialization during the Soviet era? Haven't a clue. This is why it is so terrifying to see Britain and America throwing themselves enthusiastically into an international problem with its roots so deep in the past. Roots that they don't even know about. I seriously doubt whether either Boris Johnson or Joe Biden have even heard of the Holodomor or know about the Ukrainian SS units at Treblinka or what happened at Baba Yar and all the rest of it. This does not bode well for the future because we in the West are getting sucked deeper and deeper into a conflict about which most people know nothing at all. It's really not going to end well. Young people forget history. I've had these books, like Baba Yar and the Gulag Archipelago, for 50 years or so, since the early 70s. And I don't even know if people like Kuznetsov are still in print in the West. Again, I remember in the late 1960s, everybody being madly enthusiastic too in this country about this book. It's Yevtushenko's poems. One of them, of course, was called, when was this? I don't even know how long I've had this. Okay, this is the 1973 edition of Yevtushenko. One of his poems, one of the poems in that book, was very famous at that time. It's called Baba Yar, and it was set to music by Shostakovich. It may be my imagination, but I fancy there is less interest in foreign affairs and history than there was 50 years ago. Certainly at that time, Ukrainian history was more widely known than seems to be the case today, when not one person in 1,000 has even heard of the Holodomor, let alone Baba Yar. The advantage of books like these, of course, is that they cannot be altered or edited, unlike websites and digital media. This is why I still tend to rely upon books for information rather than turning to the internet, because I can't help noticing that stuff on the internet vanishes and is altered, and I can compare it with original text like this that I know for certain sure I've had for 50 years, and sometimes I can see discrepancies turning up, but not in my books.